actually quite difficult to say where the story of London's Underground begins. You have to remember that in as early as 1800, London was the largest city in the world. It had a large population with many, many people wanting to live in London and travel to work. In the early years, London's transport system was based around the horse. Horse-drawn buses and later on horse-drawn trams were the only real means of conveying people around the streets of the City of London. Traffic congestion from a very early time was a big problem, and throughout the first part of the 19th century you find a succession of committees and commissions looking into the problem of London's traffic. I suppose the most important one from the Underground's point of view was a commission that was started in 1855 to look at the problem of traffic congestion in London. One of the proposals that they looked at was for an underground railway, which was put forward very largely by a very important figure, Charles Pearson, who was Solicitor to the City of London. He had several interests. He was interested in housing, amongst other things. He wanted to clear London's slums and find a way of getting the slum dwellers relocated to better surroundings.
Much of London was filthy, poverty-stricken, disease-ridden. In tunnelling.
You can't understand the growth of London without relating transport developments to it, not just rail. It was the horse bus that first enabled London to grow outwards. But of course, by the 1840s, London had grown far enough out that it took about an hour to travel in from the perimeter. Now, it's a strange thing, but people are prepared to travel for about an hour. If it's over an hour, then they look for some alternative.
Playing into the whole thing was the arrival and development of steam railways. They started up, of course, in 1829 with the Liverpool and Manchester Railway, and thereafter they developed nationally as a way of carrying people between cities. In London, this didn't actually solve anything. It actually made the problem slightly worse, because the mainline railway companies, as they arrived in London, wanted to build their termini as close as they could to the city centre. A commission very early on had decided that the railways couldn't be allowed right into the city centre because of the destruction of property that would be required. So they were forced to build their terminal stations in a ring around the city centre. Now the point is, the only way they could do that was either on foot or by cab, and the cabs were horse-drawn. So the railways actually brought more and more people into London and made the traffic congestion situation worse. Pearson's idea, as well as solving some of the housing problems by relocating people to the suburbs, was to connect together the mainline railway stations with a railway system. The issue was how to build such a railway in London when it was so incredibly built up. He didn't start out from the point of view that it had to be an underground railway. That emerged later as a practical solution to the problem. You had to put a railway in. How? Well, you couldn't knock down all these houses, so why not tunnel underneath them? And thus, the Metropolitan Railway was born. A company was formed and capital was finally raised, and work started initially on a stretch between Paddington and Farringdon, connecting together on the way Euston and King's Cross. The railway was built by a technique known as cut and cover tunnelling, what they do with all the smoke and steam within the confines of a tunnel. They solved the problem partly by leaving the tunnel open wherever they could to allow the smoke and steam to escape. And very early on there was an effort to build a special locomotive designed by John Fowler, one of the engineers involved, which was intended to consume its own smoke, to use a piece of common vocabulary at the time. It was a condensing engine, so the steam was, rather than being put up the funnel, was directed back into the water tanks and turned back into water for the boiler. Unfortunately, Fowler's locomotive turned into a rather dismal failure. It just didn't have the steaming capacity to pull a train, and the whole project was abandoned. Instead, they stuck with a more conventional design of engine, still condensing, that was essential, and they were supplied initially by the Great Western Railway, a design built by Daniel Gooch. Now, the Metropolitan Railway got into difficulties with the Great Western very early on. They fell out over the operating agreement, and the Met very quickly placed its own order for locomotives, and you can see an example of the type that was delivered in 1866 behind me. Very important engine, quite powerful for its time. As I say, it's a condensing locomotive. You can see the huge pipes leading up from the cylinders and down into the side tanks. And they were extremely successful. They stayed in service right through until 1905, pulling passenger trains around the Met, later, of course, the District and the Circle.
Just beat me by 4 years, but I fired her and driven her many a time, and I'm still steaming. She isn't.
The Met's first chief engineer, John Fowler, specified that she should condense her own steam.
Trouble was the water in the tanks got warm, so we had to keep on picking out fresh.
They must have been wonderful times, with Alice in Wonderland just published, the first transatlantic cable, the first tin of condensed milk.
The fireman's wages were 3 and 6 a day. The driver got 6 and 6 right up until 1890.
Prussia rumbling forward too, and the air thick with ideas and political change. Gladstone himself in one of Smith & Knight's wagons, Shaftesbury. Number 23 must have hauled many of these. No doubt she hauled the crowds for Queen Victoria's Jubilee.
Running all night we were. The Met never paid overtime, but they gave us a week's extra pay. That's how I remember it. You would remember that, wouldn't you?
The first underground railway in the world. Great achievement. The Times was prophesying that nobody would go on it because of the sewer rats and all the rest of it. In fact, it was very popular right from the beginning. It was quickly extended to Hammersmith, and in 1864, the Metropolitan started to issue workmen's fares. And these workmen's fares cost, I think, threepence return, and at that, certainly, the skilled section of the working classes were able to move out of the centre. The main lines copied this into Waterloo, into what became Liverpool Street, and it was this, the Underground Railway and the workmen's fares on the suburban main lines, that made it possible for the slums to start to be cleared. And that is really stage one.
The 1860s were boom years for railway promotion in London. The first mainline extension over the river from the south was completed to a new terminus at Victoria in 1860. Other railways followed, opening terminus stations at Charing Cross and Ludgate Hill and Cannon Street by 1866. A parliamentary select committee in 1863 recommended the construction of an underground railway along the north bank of the Thames to serve all these southern mainline terminus stations under construction. It was suggested that this new line should be connected at either end with extensions of the Metropolitan line to complete an inner circle underground railway for London. But this inner circle would not be achieved for another 20 years. The success of the Metropolitan led to the opening of the Metropolitan and District Railway in 1868, soon to be known simply as the District. The District quickly extended through Kensington to Victoria. The Thames Embankment was being built at this time, and a railway could be incorporated under that. So that by 1870, the District ran right round from Moorgate to Mansion House.
The success of the Met led to the building of the District Railway, or the Metropolitan and District Railway as it was then known, the first bit opening in 1868, and the Circle Line, as we now know it, was completed in 1884. Now, there's a tale which hangs on the completion of the Circle Line. First of all, although a lot of slums were demolished during the construction, which satisfied Charles Pearson, the construction of new suburbs to house the people displaced didn't really take place. People were crammed in more and more into less and less housing, and actually made the social housing problem rather worse. Furthermore, the metropolitan and district and circle, because they actually circumnavigated the centre, didn't really solve the traffic problem either. Building the last little bit of the circle through the city, round via Tower Hill, was so expensive because of the value of the real estate was huge, that it actually bankrupted the country's biggest railway contractor, Messrs. Peto and Betts. Now, clearly, this was not a solution for the future. The concept was okay, taking people underground to get them out of the way of the traffic, but building by the cut and cover method was definitely not on to solve the problem in the city centre. So really, the way forward was to find a new form of tunnelling and also to find a new form of traction.
Almost half a century before, Mark Brunel, father of the more famous Isambard Kingdom Brunel, had constructed the Thames Tunnel, the first tunnel under the river. It was a financial disaster and took nearly 20 years to complete, with interruptions to the work.
The interesting thing about Brunel's tunnel was that it started off an engineering process. He invented a machine to dig this tunnel known as a tunnelling shield. It was a device which was designed to protect tunnelling miners whilst digging a tunnel through the very soft ground that lies underneath London. As he dug under the Thames, this iron device effectively held back the walls while the tunnels were building and digging away at the earth, and the tunnel was bricked up behind, the shield being pushed forward gradually, a bit at a time, by hydraulic rams. Now, Brunel's effort was a commercial disaster. He did succeed in digging the tunnel, and in fact today it's used as part of the East London line. It was taken over by the Underground in the 1880s.
The later Tower subway, opened in 1869,
Simply an iron cylinder equipped with a bulkhead with a door in it to protect the miners while they were working, and hydraulic rams to propel the machine forward through the soft clay under London. And the idea was that miners would work within the protection of the shield, dig out a little bit of clay, the rams would push the machine forward, and then they would erect in the trailing end of the shield an iron lining which would hold back the clay. And that was the basis, if you like, of the tube system in London today.
With the Great Head Shield, men could advance a tunnel by 13 feet in half a day, the other half day being spent securing the lining and grouting the new section. But with the great potential of deep tunnelling realised, there was still the problem of how to propel trains in these tunnels, soon called tubes. No ventilation was possible for steam haulage. The Tower subway used a cable car system. The cars were hauled by cable powered by static steam winding engines at either end of the tunnel. But the cars were small, inconvenient for passengers, and the winding engines unreliable. It failed and was then used as cable haulage was still untried for pulling trainloads of passengers. The next great advance was through electricity, both for lighting and power. Werner von Siemens' system of electric traction had been demonstrated in Berlin in 1879 and was used on Volksrailway in Brighton 4 years later. By 1887, a number of electric tramways were successfully operating in Germany, the United States, and in Britain.
The original idea was to build a tube under the Thames from the city down in the direction of Stockwell. The first plan was to run it by stationary engines and rope, but in 1888, a clever American called Frank Sprague showed that a considerable number of trams could be run simultaneously by electric motors. in Richmond, Virginia. And this caused the promoters of what became the City and South London Railway to switch to electric traction. They took the best advice, but they inevitably made mistakes. They built the whole thing too small, the engines were tiny, it couldn't carry many passengers, it wasn't commercial, they couldn't make enough money. But of course, they showed the way. And the first effective tube line was the Central London Railway, as it was called, the Twopenny Tube, from the city out to Shepherd's Bush, along the main central artery, which did make a lot of money. And this brought in Charles Tyson Yerkes, an American, who had a very shady career as a promoter of rapid transit in Chicago, had been run out of Chicago by the city fathers there, and saw possibilities of a similar sort of operation in London. He arrived in London, managed to persuade the Americans to finance a number of railways, tubes, that had got their Acts of Parliament, but nobody in this country was prepared to finance them for the obvious reason that folks in this country realised the cost and that it wasn't commercial.
After the Central, 3 more tubes were achieved with the instead later part of the Northern Line, all opened by 1907. None were commercially viable, but thanks to the Americans, London got its tubes. Charles Yerkes had seen the heart of London's tube system constructed, but no further tubes were to be built for another 60 years.
In 1890 we had the first deep-level tube railway in London, which was the City and South London Railway, which is a combination of 2 things, the practicality of electric traction and the existence of a huge bed of clay under the city, which made deep-level tunnelling a possibility. First of all, this was seen as a kind of underground street for urban traffic only. There was no question of suburban expansion at that stage. Although the other railways, which you heard about earlier, the District and the Metropolitan line, which were in London just below the street, they already had a certain amount of suburban traffic from places like Ealing and Harrow and Willesden, but nothing very significant. Last of the first phase of the deep-level tube railways finished, it was just an underground street at very deep level. The tube railways were the first time in which railways became classless. You might say that an element of democracy was introduced for the first time because they didn't have special classifications, first, second and third class accommodation on the trains. Everyone had to travel, whether they were in the upper class, middle class or working class, they all travelled together on the tube railways. Level tube railway expansion into the suburbs with what is now called the Northern Line, the line between Charing Cross and Golders Green. They had to go to Golders Green because that was the only place where they could build car sheds, but this was rather an astute move because they also saw it as an opportunity to develop suburban growth. And in fact, the people who were paying for the tube railway were behind the scenes investing money as well in land and so forth, the Americans who were financing the tube railway. And Golders Green took off very rapidly. From 1907 to 1914, a huge new suburb appeared where virtually there'd been nothing but green fields before.
The Americans then sent over a very bright man who'd made his way managing electric tramways in the States, a man called Albert Stanley, the future Lord Ashfield. And he managed to keep the railways going by renegotiating loans and all sorts of things of that sort. But his main coup was in being able to buy out the London General Omnibus Company just after that had developed a satisfactory motor bus. Now, it's the motor buses that make the money, not the trains, not the underground.
London Underground is not only the oldest underground railway in the world, it's also the most distinctive in terms of its look. You can always recognise the London Underground from a distance by the bar and circle symbol, which appears everywhere above ground, and the look of the stations, the look of the rolling stock, and it's something that's been emulated all over the world. The origins of the distinctive look of the Underground, I think, go back to the first decade of the 20th century, when a number of the new tube lines were opened. They had a problem, a marketing problem, as we'd call it today, because they'd spent a lot of money building these new lines. They hadn't got enough passengers. They needed to find new ways to attract people onto the system. A lot of the marketing that was developed in the early years of the century was down to one man, Frank Pick, who joined the new Underground Electric Railways of London, as it was then called, as initially its traffic officer. His main job was to publicise the system. And one of the first things he did was to start publicising it through posters. And this became the distinctive trademark of the Underground. They're very high quality graphic design posters, starting from about 1908. And within a fairly short space of time, the Underground was becoming quite famous, really, as a commissioner of high quality graphic design, and was using artists ranging from the young, new, innovative artists and quite radical styles to some of the more conservative, traditional designers. So there was a very wide range of posters, but all of them had a distinctive look because they also had distinctive lettering on them. He actually commissioned Edward Johnston, who was one of the leading lettering experts of the time, to design a whole typeface for the Underground, and the Johnston lettering has been used ever since 1916 for the Underground's lettering. A new version called New Johnston is still in use today. And Pick also developed and introduced onto the posters and elsewhere on the system the famous bar and circle device, the London Transport symbol, which started off in use on underground stations as a way of simply naming the station, the bar, and a disc at that stage behind it, and it developed into the bar and circle we know today.
The other thing that I should perhaps mention is the effect the tube had on the West End. The West End of London was, for a long time, an upper-class residential area with very few shops and virtually no business development. But after the tubes arrived in the 1900s, they much encouraged the growth of the big departmental stores like Selfridges and D.H. Evans and Debenham and Freebody and all those big shops, and Harrods at Knightsbridge. The prosperity, which had been greatly assisted by the existence of the tube railways, which was brought to these shops, was seen in the way they rebuilt and expanded very greatly in the 20s and 30s, so that Regent Street and Oxford Street and Knightsbridge became some of the finest shopping streets in Europe. They owed a lot of this to the tube railways.
The outbreak of war in 1914 halted further development of the system, but increased passenger traffic by 67%, with little additional rolling stock and shortage of staff. Women were taken on in many exclusively male jobs pre-war.
London Passenger Transport Board took over, and they named the area Metroland. It's a very familiar term.
During the 1920s, the system began to receive government subsidies, supporting further expansion out into the suburbs. Stations were being modernised and more were fitted with escalators for quicker access to trains. And new rolling stock was being introduced.
You always had a driver who, a motorman they called it on the Underground, who regarded himself as really the top-notch person. And in the early days he had a guard and...
Frank Pick, as he rose through the company, by the 1920s had become assistant managing director and had broadened his design interests far beyond the basics of publicity and posters, although he still kept that interest. And he was by that stage commissioning the architects who were designing the new stations for the Underground's extensions into the suburbs. The man that Pick struck up a very productive relationship with was Charles Holden, who was already quite a well-known architect. Pick found with Holden that he was working with someone who was very sympathetic to the idea of creating new structures, underground stations, which were appropriate to their function, but not just functional, but also were of a high-quality look. And he began this with the Morden extension stations in the 1920s. And they are a very clever design because essentially what Holden came up with is a series of folding screen frontages for the street facades of these stations, which look as though they're part of the same family, but are not exactly the same. So they're quite interesting in design terms. They're still distinctive. They make use of the bar and circle again, both in flat form on the frontages of the station. They're in glass, illuminated from behind, so that you can see the station from a long distance off, and also in three-dimensional form on the columns on the front of the station. At the top of the capitals, Holden has rather cleverly reinterpreted the bar and circle as the top of the capitals on the front of the building. And this development of a distinctive house style is something that Holden then moved on from the Morden line stations to come up with, if you like, a standard design for underground stations which could be varied according to the site they were building on. The heart of the Underground, as well as the heart of Britain and the heart of Empire, if you like, was Piccadilly Circus. That station was rebuilt in the 1920s using Charles Holden as the architect, and they incorporated various artworks. And the artwork above the escalators showed everything homing in across the world on London, Piccadilly Circus, the heart of Empire and London.
Holden also designed the new underground headquarters at 55 Broadway, completed in 1929 and still the headquarters today. His distinctive house style became standard design for underground stations, regarded as some of the finest commercial architecture of the 20s and 30s. The uneasy association between the many transport companies was replaced by one governing board in 1933, London Passenger Transport Board, London Transport. This operated as a public authority with an absolute monopoly of bus, tram, trolleybus and underground railway services over some 2,000 square miles. (1933) was also the first year that Harry Beck's famous diagrammatic map of the system appeared. This classic design has been retained with variations and additions down the years, and is still the basis of today's journey planner.
That was a stimulus to the entertainment industry. The cinemas around Leicester Square and Piccadilly Circus, Tottenham Court Road, cinemas and theatres, they all took up very well with the convenience and access of the tube railways provided, with trains running till after midnight. People in those days, not many people owned cars, and they used public transport, and very often they would come into London for a special...
Closed by order for urgent structural alterations. Special buses were put on to take over the transport of thousands of workers who normally use these routes. London Transport have undertaken a vast program of emergency works which make the Underground as safe in wartime as in peace. Risk of flooding, either from a bomb in the Thames or the breaking of a water main, has been overcome by huge floodgates, which will isolate the danger zone immediately an alarm is given. Through it all, the London people are carrying on. They rise to new heights of greatness with each trial they face. Entertainers hit by the closing of the theatres do their bit to brighten the long evenings underground. Nobody wants to live underground, but if life is to be lived like this on the battlefront, then Britain can carry on as long as anyone. Reason and humanity have no place in the Nazi code.
Latest addition to London's underground system is the Central Line extension from Liverpool Street to Stratford. the Minister of Transport, Mr. Alfred Barnes, opened the line by turning a golden key, which changed the signal lights and unveiled the new stretch of line, which cost over £3 million to complete. To round off the ceremony, the Minister, his wife and officials of London Transport were taken for a ride by the senior driver who once worked on the old twopenny tube. Taking its place in London's vast network, the new line now enters the service of the public, who will add to their own comfort by the way if they remember that warning and stagger their hours of travel if they can. London transport planners and engineers win new honours with the opening of the Central Line tube extension to Newbury Park and Woodford. One of the new stations, Wanstead, was the setting for the inauguration ceremony, and 8-year-old Terence Wilson, in complete London transport uniform, greeted Mrs. Barnes, wife of the Minister of Transport. Mr. Barnes himself declared the extension open.
I now have pleasure in declaring open the Newbury Park and Woodford extensions of the Central Line.
With the turning of a golden key, the gate swings back and all's clear for the first train to go through with members of the official party on board. Greenford, London, and the opening of the 10-mile tube extension by the Minister of Transport, Mr. Barnes. The new line, the longest single addition to the system for 31 years, will provide speedy transport for another 6.5 million travellers a year.
On January the 1st, 1948, London Transport was nationalised with the 4 main railway companies. Becoming part of the British Transpine in the 1950s gave us aluminium alloy bodywork and underframe construction. Unpainted silver trains became standard on the system.
London, breaking away from the traditional red, an all-silver aluminium underground train will shortly go into service on the Piccadilly line. With improved seating and lighting, it's the first train in Britain to be fitted with rubber springs. Maybe this will mean a more comfortable stretch for rush hour travellers.
The story of the development of the underground railways really falls into 3 phases, which are quite distinct, quite intelligible. The first one was getting the things built and created, and that was to move people around within central London. Then between the wars, between 1920 and 1940, the great thing was carrying these out further into the suburbs, which enabled the suburbs to grow, South Harrow and places like that. When we all came back after the war, we found that there was a third and quite different problem, and that was that the centre was seizing up again very badly. There were more offices, there were more developments, people were leaving the city and going to the West End, and many more people were being brought into London by the mainline railways to the terminals at Euston and Victoria and Waterloo. So what we had to do then was to do another strand through the existing network in the centre, and that was called the Victoria line. It took a lot of argument, a lot of persuasion, and it took about 15 years, half a generation, from when it was first brought before the public to when it was opened. In the 20th century, that's not bad going for a public enterprise.
There's news today about the new Victoria-Walthamstow Underground. Tunnelling has begun at a number of places. The line will take 5 years to complete. Over 20 miles of tunnelling will be needed and 12 new stations. Oxford Circus above ground will be roofed over for 3 years so that rebuilding can go on below. Congestion on other lines will be greatly reduced, and a new artery to the northeastern areas of Greater London will be opened up.
automatic fare collection, a series of new concepts, new equipment, signal engineer's responsibility, automatic train operation. The old-style driver becomes the hands-off train operator on Britain's first fully automatic passenger railway. The black boxes take over. They tell the driver what they're going to do next. They make the train obey the signals. After a signal check, they restart the train, accelerate it, and run it at the best possible speed for the prevailing operating conditions. But the man is there, qualified and experienced, with power to override the mechanism should anything go wrong.
The difficulty was that everything was so automatic on that train. Once he'd pushed the button, it took off, it obeyed signals on the way, stopped and restarted if necessary, and when it got to the platform at the next station, it sat down and the doors opened. So what was there left for the motorman to do? The advice we were given was, so you must have one step in the progression, which is absolutely vital, and the chap has got to intervene, make his own decision to do it each time. Because there are many cases of automated operations where, when the crisis has come, very highly intelligent paid people have been absolutely transfixed. They haven't known what to do because they got out of practice. We designed it so that once the train has got into the station and the doors have opened, there must be the intervention of the driver at each place, pressing two buttons simultaneously to close the doors and start the process over again. Then there arose the issue about the airport, how to get Heathrow served. Unfortunately, we had the Piccadilly line pointing towards it, about 3.5 miles away at Hounslow West. And so we got that in there. Well, London was quite well ahead in that. It was, in fact, the first capital city in the world which got its own Metropolitan Railway connection with its own airport. And that took another 11 years after the Victoria line was opened. That came in 1978. Then we opened the Jubilee line, and that took the Bakerloo, which before that had been in the shape of a Y, coming together at Baker Street and causing horrible congestion up through the middle, into an X.
It's good news for London's commuter population.
The first section of the Jubilee line from Stanmore to Charing Cross was opened in 1979 by the Prince of Wales.
Easily cleaned materials have been used on all services. Like a seasoned commuter, the Prince takes a ride, but unlike a regular, he rides up front in the driver's cab.
That Jubilee line is now approved to be extended, wiggling about through Westminster and Waterloo and Bermondsey, then to turn up again to the Canary Wharf developments and up to Stratford. So if you go from end to end of that line, you'll be doing something of a very peculiar shape. It's not very direct, but at any rate, it will bring the underground into some parts of London, southeast London, which have been without it and feel very much deprived without it. So that is positive.
Surface traffic in London is probably about the same as it was 100, 120 years ago. And into that environment came the railways and came the underground. And that allows about 4 times as many people to get into the city and Westminster as was then possible. So the underground isn't a transport system, it is London. It's what makes London work. It's the arteries of London. It's the only reason that all these people can come together and do this peculiar and special and very profitable exercise called the City and Westminster.
The The main importance of the tube railways in particular was the way in which it enabled London to move about, because if we didn't have them, the whole of the centre of London would be log jammed with cars and you just wouldn't get any traffic movement at all. In fact, they make life in London possible, I think.
It's difficult to imagine London without its underground system. It's the absolute lifeblood of the city. It would just come to a standstill without it. There's no way that you could get around London, realistically, without the underground being there. And I think so long as London is a vibrant city, the underground has got to be the heart of it.
London Transport and London have always had a terribly close relationship. The development of one is inextricably tied up with the development of the other. London Underground, of course, has played a very important role in that, helping to move people around the city. London Transport has always had a very important collection of historic artefacts and relics and other records. And since 1980, we have had here in Covent Garden a fully professional museum service to preserve those collections and to make them available to the public. As well as motor buses and trams and things, we've got a very good collection of underground artefacts, tube railway carriages, and a great deal of material on things like signalling, the way the underground is actually operated from day to day. It would be quite difficult to get our whole collection of railway rolling stock into this building, but we've got a great deal of models which help us to tell the story. So within the context of London, its development and its people, the London Transport Museum sets out to tell the full story of London Underground.